In the winter of 1889, during the final stages of a long-delayed renovation, fire consumed what remained of the Greymount Seminary for wayward girls. The blaze began in the eastern dormitory, spread quickly to the chapel, and by dawn, the roof had collapsed inward like a closing jaw. The authorities blamed faulty wiring, a curious conclusion given that the building had never been fitted for electricity, but that wasn't what the workers remembered most. It was the hearth in the headmistress's quarters. While sifting through the blackened remains of the fireplace, a laborer named Matthew Clay struck stone. Beneath the hearthstone, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed in wax, they found a thick leather-bound ledger, burnt around the edges but intact. A name was carved into the cover, precise and clean despite the smoke damage: S. Greymount. Inside were 67 entries, each marked by initials, age, and a strange set of notations, coded symbols, tally marks, and words like unsuitable, corrected, or incomplete. The final 10 pages had only a single word repeated over and over: lamb. None of this made it into the official report. What you're about to hear has never been published in any academic journal, nor mentioned in polite society. The records were sealed, the witnesses discredited, and the families paid to forget. But I've spent the last 8 years gathering every surviving letter, every interview, every court document that was never meant to be seen. And what I've found is worse than even the rumors dared suggest. This is the macabre history of the Greymount family, a tale not just of cruelty, but of belief twisted into ritual, of silence weaponized, and of innocence turned sacrificial. If you've ever wondered how darkness hides beneath the mask of virtue, this story will stay with you long after the final name is read aloud. Before we descend into the ash and silence they left behind, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell icon so you never miss the next hidden history they don't want you to hear. Share this with someone who thinks they've seen true horror, because what happened here? Most still refuse to believe it. Now, let's go back. Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, 1854. The Greymount estate had sat vacant for 14 years, its stone facade blackened from a lightning strike in '39 that split the eastern gable like an open wound. Originally built in 1783 by Tobias Greymount, a shipping baron turned land reformer, the estate had once been the pride of the region. Then the family stopped appearing in public. The gates rusted shut. The orchard overgrew itself. And by the time anyone dared walk the grounds again, it was not as a home, but as a place of reform. That year, a small announcement appeared in the Lancaster Herald. The Greymount estate shall be reopened as a private seminary for the restoration and moral instruction of wayward girls, under the stewardship of Miss Sybil Greymount, returned from Geneva after years of theological refinement. Geneva. It gave the statement an air of continental prestige, of sacred purpose. No one questioned it. Nor did they question the quiet donation from the diocese, or the swift approval from the county judge, himself a father to 3 young girls. If Miss Sybil Greymount, a woman of lineage and grace, wished to open a refuge for troubled girls, who were they to stand in her way? Miss Greymount returned that spring, tall, rail-thin, and perpetually veiled, even indoors. She wore mourning black despite no known death in the family. Her hands were always gloved. Her voice was soft, deliberate, and theologically assured. She spoke of the necessary suffering of the soul, of refining the vessel through obedience, and of shaping the lambs before they're led astray. With her came 2 others. Her brother Elias, silent and gaunt, never seen without a worn copy of the Psalms pressed to his chest. And a child, a girl no older than 12, with pale eyes, porcelain skin, and long black hair that always fell in front of her face. Her name was Florence. Her niece, Sybil said once, but never again. They arrived in a black carriage with no driver. Over the next 4 months, laborers converted the estate into what the papers called a sanctuary for lost virtue. The chapel was restored. Stained glass was installed, curiously, not of Christ or the Virgin, but of Old Testament scenes. Abraham raising the knife, Job weeping beneath the storm, Lot's wife turning to salt. By September, they were ready. The first students arrived in the rain, girls aged 12 to 16, sent by parish councils, overburdened mothers, and judges eager to avoid the embarrassment of scandal. Most had no real crimes. A theft here, a pregnancy there, a refusal to speak, a refusal to obey. The sin didn't matter. What mattered was appearance. These girls made certain people uncomfortable, and so to Greymount they went. Among the first were Judith Monroe, 15, the daughter of a pharmacist who'd run away twice; Elsie Brandt, 13, whose uncle claimed she was incapable of proper female submission; and Abigail Farrell, 14, whose parents had died in a house fire and whose silence unnerved every foster family she passed through. The girls were met at the gates by Elias, who stood without lantern or umbrella. He motioned for them to enter, but said nothing. A few tried to ask questions. He only blinked. When the last carriage departed, Sybil addressed them in the great hall. "You are not here to be punished," she said. "You are here to be softened, to be guided. The world outside thinks it knows what to do with you. It doesn't. That's why you're here, because we do." The girls were issued gray dresses, wooden rosaries, and a slim volume titled Obedience, the First Door to God. They were given numbers, not rooms. Judith was 7. Elsie was 14. Abigail simply 1. The dormitories were Spartan. Iron beds, no mirrors, no writing utensils, 1 hour of speech allowed per day during meals. On the chapel door hung a sign: "Enter only when called. Kneel only when unseen." The first week passed in silence and suspicion. Judith tried to map the estate but discovered the halls rearranged themselves at night. Elsie cried once, only once, then stared at nothing for hours. Abigail whispered prayers under her breath that no one recognized. At night, Florence walked the halls, always barefoot, always humming. No one stopped her. No one ever would. The first real storm of autumn arrived with a scream. Judith Monroe sat upright in bed before she was even fully awake, heart pounding, the sound already fading. The other girls stirred, some grumbling, some wrapping their arms around themselves, but none admitted to hearing what she heard. A sharp, slicing cry. Not wind, not animal, human, and not far. She slipped from her bed, pressed her bare feet to the freezing stone floor, and padded to the window. The orchard beyond the rear wall swayed with black branches, and in the brief flashes of lightning, she saw the outline of someone standing by the chapel. Small, still, head tilted. Florence. But Florence wasn't supposed to be outside. No one was. The next morning, during silent breakfast, Judith tried to speak, tried to ask if anyone else had seen her. But the rules were strict. Speaking outside meal hour meant 1 day without bread. Speaking of hallucinations meant reflection time. Speaking of Florence at all? That had already become a kind of taboo. So, she said nothing. She watched. That same day, Sybil gathered the girls in the common room, a high-ceilinged chamber with 1 long row of pews. She did not sit. She stood at the front, veiled as always, hands clasped, a thin leather-bound book resting on the podium. "Today marks the beginning of your moral refinement," she said, her voice soft enough to make the girls lean forward. Each of you was sent here because someone saw that the world had bent your spirit. We are not here to punish that. We are here to straighten it. Her gloved hand rested on the book. This is the Ash Wednesday Doctrine, she said, a series of procedures developed in Geneva by spiritual minds far wiser than any this country has produced. It is not a set of punishments. It is a way to reform the soul when language, correction, and prayer have failed. She turned a page. Each Wednesday, 3 of you will be called to the chapel of correction. There, you will speak your internal distortions aloud. Not to me, not to the others, but to the quiet presence of God as made manifest through obedience. You will stand at the pulpit, facing away from your sisters. You will not lie, and you will not leave until the burden has passed from you. Judith glanced at Elsie, who was already trembling. Abigail stared straight ahead, her hands clenched in her lap. You may feel shame. Good, Sybil continued. That means you have not been fully lost. You may feel fear. Better. That means you are still awake. But understand this. Silence when called is refusal to heal, and refusal to heal is an invitation to be made example of. No one moved. The first 3 will be 1, 7, 14. Abigail, Judith, Elsie. They were told to wash their hands and mouths before entering. They were given white slips of cotton to wear over their uniforms, and they were led one by one into the chapel by Elias, whose eyes never blinked and whose breath never clouded the cold air. Judith was last. When her turn came, the chapel was lit only by a row of candles and the flickering stained glass. The pulpit had been raised since her last glimpse of it, with a low wooden platform behind it, and a single chair facing the altar, which was now draped in white silk. A large iron bell stood beside it, one she'd never seen before. Elias gestured for her to stand at the pulpit. The other girls, seated in rows, were facing the back wall. They were not allowed to look at her. Sybil stood behind the altar, still as a statue. "Speak what rots," she said, her voice barely more than a breath. Judith hesitated. Her throat tightened. The silence stretched. She thought of her mother's scream the night she ran away, the way her father refused to look for her, the ache of hunger, of wrongness, of being unwanted. I stole." A pause. "I stole food and a hymnal and coins from a church." Sybil nodded but said nothing. Judith glanced down. Her palms were damp, her breath fogged. "I ran away," she added, her voice sharper. "I lied about where I came from. I hit a boy who tried to touch me." Still silence. She felt something then, a strange tension in the air, like a thread being pulled taut behind her. She turned slightly, just enough to catch movement from the side of her eye. Florence, standing in the far left corner, barefoot, watching. Sybil did not move. Elias stepped forward and struck the iron bell once. The sound echoed through the rafters, low, deep, like the groan of something ancient awakening beneath the floorboards. Judith felt it in her spine. "You may sit," Sybil said. When Judith returned to the pew, Abigail was shaking. Elsie had her eyes closed, and Florence had vanished. That night, none of them spoke. The air in the dormitory was heavier, as if the building itself was pressing in. Judith lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts circling what she'd felt. It hadn't been confession. It had been performance. The next day, the girls were assigned a new reading. The Geneva Pattern, a guide to internal rectitude. The text was handbound, with no publishing mark. Page after page described the purification of female error through silence, repetition, and isolation. Judith asked Constance, the only staff member who ever smiled, if the book was real theology. Constance hesitated. "I haven't read that one," she said, "but I wouldn't take it to church." Later that evening, a strange event shook the building. Elsie began to cry during prayer, loud, racking sobs that turned to gasps. The other girls froze. Sybil walked calmly to her, placed a hand on her shoulder, and whispered something none of the others heard. Elsie stopped crying, then smiling, then blank. She was escorted out by Elias. She did not return that night. In her bed, Judith found a crumpled page tucked into the mattress. It was torn from the hymnal Elsie had been issued. A single phrase was scrawled over the music in frantic handwriting. "I heard the bell even when no one spoke." Judith folded it carefully and hid it under her pillow. The next day, Florence stood at the window during morning prayers, her hand pressed to the glass. Outside, in the fog-shrouded orchard, something pale moved among the trees. A girl in a white shift. Too tall to be Elsie, too still to be real. Judith looked to Abigail, who saw it too, and Florence whispered, just loud enough to hear, "She wasn't the first." It started with the eyes. Not in any obvious way, not at first. But as the weeks passed and the Wednesday confessions continued, Judith began to notice a pattern in the other girls. A slow, subtle draining. Their gazes grew vacant, movements stiff, smiles faded. It was as if something behind their eyes had dimmed, like candles snuffed in the night. Even Abigail, always steady, always sharp, began blinking slower, her focus drifting toward nothing in particular. It wasn't just exhaustion, it was removal. Florence was the only one untouched. She floated through the hallways like a shadow in silk. She never spoke, never disobeyed. Yet she was everywhere, in the chapel before dawn, at the window during storms, at the foot of Judith's bed once, just once, during that strange hour between night and morning. She hadn't done anything. She just stood there, and when Judith sat up in terror, Florence tilted her head and smiled. That was the first night Judith began keeping notes. She tore blank pages from the back of her hymnal and tucked them inside the lining of her mattress. She documented everything. The confessions, the bell, the girls who didn't return right away. Elsie was gone for 3 full days. When she came back, she didn't look anyone in the eye. She sat perfectly still. She scratched her arms until they bled. During lunch, Judith whispered her name. Elsie looked up, blinked once, then reached across the table and placed a tiny white stone in Judith's hand. It was warm. No explanation, no words, just the stone, and then her eyes dropped back to her plate. That night, Judith cracked the stone in half. The center was stained pink. Blood, maybe, maybe not. There was something etched inside the surface, a symbol, circular, with 3 vertical lines and 1 horizontal slash through the middle. She'd seen it before, on the chapel doors, carved faintly into the baseboards of the pulpit, hidden beneath coats of black paint, but there all the same. Judith sketched it in her journal. And that's when the dreams began. She found herself standing in the orchard, barefoot and numb, watching rows of girls walk silently into a pit of ash. No screams, no resistance. One by one, they disappeared into the darkness, guided by a figure in a white veil. When Judith stepped forward, she felt her own feet sinking into soft soil, and a voice whispered from the trees. She was born without breath, but we taught her to hum. Judith woke gasping. The next day, she noticed something else. The younger girls, those under 13, had started speaking in unison during their morning prayers. Not just the standard lines, but new phrases. Lines not in their books. Lines Sybil never taught. Let the vessel be emptied, that the lamb may pour through. What is bruised may be broken. What is broken may be blessed. Judith asked Constance about the phrases. Constance looked disturbed. They're not in the curriculum, she said quietly. And they didn't come from me. Judith pressed. Then where? I don't know, Constance admitted, but I've started hearing them in my sleep. That same evening, a girl named Mary Collings collapsed during evening prayers. Blood seeped from her nose and ears. The other girls screamed. Sybil calmly walked over and covered Mary's face with a cloth, instructing the others to return to their dormitories. No questions, she said. Not tonight. Judith tried to stay behind, but Elias blocked the chapel door. His eyes glowed faintly in the candlelight, and for a brief second Judith was sure she saw something beneath his left sleeve. A spiral of raw, angry flesh, marked with the same circular symbol from the stone. She barely slept. By morning, Mary was gone. No bed, no belongings, no name on the roll call sheet. Judith asked Abigail, "Do you remember her last name?" Abigail frowned. Who? Mary? Mary Collings? Abigail hesitated. There's no Mary here, she said slowly, and there never was. Judith felt her stomach twist. She returned to her journal, flipped back 3 pages and found Mary's name scratched out. Not erased, not removed, just crossed out in heavy foreign ink. She hadn't done that. Someone else had. The following Wednesday, the bell didn't ring. Instead, a new ritual began. The girls were told to line up outside the chapel barefoot, dressed in white shifts, and walk in pairs around the interior perimeter of the room while Sybil recited verses from the Geneva pattern. The windows were all blacked out. The candles were extinguished. The only light came from a single lamp above the altar. Florence stood near it, holding a small box. Each girl, one by one, was called forward to place something inside. A button, a strand of hair, a tooth. Judith tried to hide her resistance by slipping in a torn scrap of cloth, but Florence opened the box after she dropped it in and said softly, "No." Sybil approached. "7," she said. "Do you lie to God?" Judith's jaw locked. "No, ma'am." Sybil nodded. "You may stay." Stay? It wasn't a dismissal. It was a sentence. After the others left, Judith remained standing in the flickering light, her hands trembling. Elias appeared from the side door with a small black book and a bowl of water. He motioned to the altar. Judith backed away. "I didn't lie." Florence tilted her head. "You didn't lie?" she echoed. "That's the problem." The last thing Judith remembered clearly was the water, freezing, thick, and the way Elias held her wrist so gently, like he was measuring her pulse for something ancient, something he could name, even if she could not. She woke up in the infirmary. Constance was beside her, wiping her brow. "You were out for a day," she whispered. Judith croaked, "What did they do to me?" Constance glanced over her shoulder, then leaned closer. "I don't know," she said. "But you screamed the entire time, and then you started laughing." Judith tried to sit up. "I need to find Abigail," she said. "You can't," Constance replied, eyes darkening. "She never came back from the orchard." Judith stared at her, and slowly, in the pit of her chest, she realized. There was no plan to let them leave. The snow arrived early that year. By mid-November, the orchard was buried beneath sheets of white, the trees sharp and skeletal, like hands frozen mid-prayer. Greymount Seminary, however, remained untouched. The snow never lingered on the roof. The stone steps leading to the chapel were always dry. And no one, not even the groundskeepers, could recall seeing a single flake land on Florence. Judith sat in the infirmary window, watching the storm roll past the iron gates. Her head ached. Her arms were marked with bruises she didn't remember receiving, and something deep in her chest, something she couldn't name, was beginning to shift. It wasn't fear. That had passed. It was clarity. The last thing she remembered before waking was a voice, not Florence's, not Sybil's, but her own, laughing and repeating a phrase she didn't understand. Only the broken sing true. Constance brought her weak tea and said little. She was paler than usual. Her smile was tight, and each time the chapel bell tolled, she flinched. "Is there a ledger?" Judith asked her. Constance blinked. "What?" "A book. A list of names. I know they're keeping one." Constance hesitated, then nodded slowly. "In the headmistress's study," she whispered. "Inside the hearth, beneath the third brick from the left. I saw Elias place it there 2 weeks ago." Judith waited until nightfall. At 2:17 a.m., a time she'd learned was safest, she crept barefoot from the infirmary, past the sleeping dormitory and toward the east wing. The halls creaked with a kind of breath. The portrait seemed to move when not looked at directly, but she didn't stop. Not until she reached the study. The hearth was cold. No fire had been lit in days. She pried loose the brick with a broken quill and pulled free a heavy leather-bound volume, cracked and scorched along the edges. The cover was marked with a single letter, L. Inside were pages of careful handwriting, names, ages, locations, each entry followed by an assessment. Judith Monroe, age 15, fractured but malleable, resistance noted, must be processed more than once. Elsie Brandt, age 13, inconsistent vessel, risk of collapse, bell failed to awaken third channel. Abigail Farrell, age 14, high resonance, initiation complete, confirmed as first echo. Judith's hands shook. Every girl had been measured, not morally, not emotionally, but spiritually, like vessels, like containers, and some had already been used. She turned the page and froze. Florence, age unknown, original seed, echo of the Lamb, requires no correction. Note: host must not be removed from locus. Proximity to flawed vessels strengthens polarity. Continued exposure equals sustained coherence of ritual. She flipped ahead. Phase 3 scheduled for Decans 13. Ceremony must coincide with full snow. Bellkeeper prepared. Vessel selection pending. That was 4 weeks away. Judith shoved the book beneath her shift and bolted. She made it halfway back before Elias appeared in the hall. He didn't speak, just stared. His eyes glowed faintly, and in the flickering lantern light she could see something moving just beneath his skin, like ink in water, spreading slowly, searching for shape. Judith backed away, hands raised. "You can't keep us here forever." Elias blinked once, then again. And then he smiled. "You were never meant to stay," he said. "You were meant to join." He stepped aside, motioning toward the dormitory. Judith fled, but she didn't go to her bed. She went to Elsie's. "Wake up," she hissed, shaking her. "We're leaving." Elsie stirred, sluggish, confused. "What?" "They're planning something. You and me, we're not going to be here for it." "But they—" "I don't care what they said. If we don't leave now, we end up like Mary, or worse." That name, Mary, sent a tremor through Elsie. Judith saw it. "She existed," Judith said. "I remember her. You do too. Say her name." Elsie opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She tried again, still nothing. Her voice was gone. Judith's throat tightened. "They've taken it from you?" Elsie nodded once, eyes wide with terror. Judith helped her out of bed, pulled a cloak from the supply closet, and led her through the servants' corridor toward the old cellar door. No one used it anymore. No one dared. But Judith had mapped it. They reached the door, breath fogging in the frigid air. She pushed. It wouldn't open. The wood groaned. The hinges screamed, but it refused to budge more than a few inches. Judith peered through the crack and saw something piled against the outside wall. Stones. Hundreds of small white stones, each marked with a symbol. Elsie fell to her knees, trembling. That's when they heard it. The hum. Faint at first, then rising. A girl's voice, Florence's voice, singing an old lullaby in a language Judith didn't know. It echoed through the hallways, through the stone, through the marrow. The light above them dimmed. Judith turned, heart racing. Florence stood at the end of the hall, not barefoot, not humming, just waiting. "Don't go," she whispered. Judith held Elsie close. "Why?" Florence blinked. "Because you're starting to hear her." "Who?" Florence stepped closer. "The lamb." Judith reached for the poker near the furnace, brandishing it between them. "She's not real," she spat. "She's a delusion, a control tactic." Florence tilted her head. "She used to be, but then we gave her a name, and now she needs a mouth." The hallway began to pulse, like it had veins, like it was alive. Judith turned to run, and the door behind her slammed shut. Florence never touched it. Judith spun back around, only to find the girl gone. In her place stood Sybil, hands folded, veil lifted just enough to reveal the lower half of her face. She was smiling. "You were doing so well," Sybil said. Judith's chest tightened. "Let us go." "I wish I could," Sybil said softly. "But you belong to her now. We all do. Some just earlier than others." She stepped aside, and from the shadows emerged a girl Judith had thought gone. Abigail, eyes pale, face slack. Walking like a puppet on strings, Florence appeared beside her, humming once more. "Say it," she whispered. Abigail opened her mouth and spoke in Judith's voice. "Only the broken sing true." Elsie screamed without sound, and the chapel bell began to toll, though no one had touched it. Judith stopped sleeping, not by choice, but by necessity. Every time she closed her eyes, she found herself elsewhere, buried beneath white stone, wrapped in linen, surrounded by girls humming in perfect, lifeless harmony. Each dream ended the same. The lamb standing at the foot of her grave, not as an animal, but as a faceless girl in a white shift, whispering with Judith's mother's voice. "Let me wear you," it said. "Let me try you on." In the waking world, things were no better. The girls no longer spoke unless spoken to. Even Constance had changed, her movements rigid, her kindness rehearsed, her eyes avoiding contact. The snow fell heavier each day, but the grounds of Greymount remained untouched. No footprints, no melt, just a white silence that never reached past the orchard. Florence was always nearby now, watching. Judith began to feel her before she saw her, like a chill in the room, or the smell of wet stone. When she passed through doorways, candles flickered. When she hummed, birds froze mid-flight and dropped from the sky. Judith knew she had only one chance left. Escape wasn't possible. Not with the doors sealed, the windows barred, the orchard littered with stones. But there was one room she hadn't explored. The reliquary. It was only ever mentioned once during the first week. A forbidden chamber at the heart of the chapel, locked behind a brass gate inscribed with Latin too worn to read. Rumor said it held relics, bones of saints perhaps, but the girls whispered something else. That it held parts of the ones who stayed too long. She waited until the chapel was empty. Wednesday night. After the third toll of the bell, while the rest of the girls were locked in evening realignment, Judith slipped from the infirmary, crossed the east corridor, and used the brass key she'd stolen from Constance's coat. The key fit. The gate opened with a sound like breath leaving lungs. The reliquary was colder than the rest of the chapel, and darker. The walls were lined with alcoves, each containing jars, bundles, or small wooden boxes wrapped in cloth. Candles lit automatically as she passed, as if her presence had been expected. At the center stood a pedestal. Upon it, a ledger, another one. This time bound in flesh-colored leather with a clasp made from what looked like finger bones. She opened it with a rag, careful not to touch it directly. The first page was dated 17-9. Acquisition. Eleanor C., age 12. First manifestation of the Lamb. Contained successfully. Yield. 4 days of purity. Second acquisition. Marjorie B., age 14. Result. Collapse after fourth hymn. Non-viable. Yield. 3 days. Florence. Year unknown. Transferred from Hollow Glen Orphanage. 0 memory. No family, no expiration. Judith turned to the most recent entries. There were names she recognized. Abigail Farrell, initiation complete, servant of the Lamb. Elsie Brandt, resistance persists, fragmented, reassignment scheduled. Judith Monroe, high resonance, vessel still rejecting full alignment, dreams consistent, symbol recognition confirmed. Her blood ran cold. There was no rescue coming, no letters, no outer world, no memory of them would remain. They weren't being raised, they were being emptied. And Florence? Florence had been emptied long ago. Judith closed the book, turned. Florence stood at the gate. "You weren't supposed to see this," she whispered. "I was never supposed to be here," Judith snapped. Florence's expression didn't change. "She chose you." Judith stepped back. "The lamb?" "No, the house." Florence pointed upward. Judith looked toward the ceiling, and for the briefest moment saw it. A shifting pattern in the beams, a circle within a circle, like an eye pressed against the fabric of the world. Watching. Always watching. "The house is her body," Florence said. "We walk her ribs, we pray in her mouth, and you—" She paused. "You've been in her thoughts too long." Judith turned and ran. Back through the reliquary. Past the brass gate. Up the stairs through the chapel. Past Elias, who didn't try to stop her, and into the North Tower. She didn't know why she ran there, only that something pulled her, urged her. At the top, a locked door. She smashed it with her shoulder. Once, twice. On the third it gave. Inside was a small circular room, dusty, forgotten, and in the center, bound to a chair with heavy ropes and eyes sewn shut, was a girl. Not more than 12. Alive. Barely. Her chest rose and fell, and around her neck, strung on twine, were dozens of the same white stones Judith had found weeks ago, each etched with the circular symbol. Judith moved forward, reaching out. The girl stirred. She spoke without opening her mouth. Don't cut them. Judith froze. Why? They're seals, the girl whispered. If they break, she wakes. The lamb? The girl nodded, barely perceptible. Why are you still alive? Judith asked. Because I said no, the girl replied, when they came to take my name. Judith looked around. The walls were covered in charcoal sketches. Circles, eyes. Girls with their mouths open wide, no teeth, no tongues. And one phrase repeated again and again, I remember what I wasn't. Judith turned back to the girl. I can get you out. No, the girl said. Get yourself out. If I leave, she'll use me. Judith hesitated. Then, what's your name? The girl smiled. That's the only thing I kept. And then she went still again. Judith backed away. And for the first time she noticed a long crack in the floor, starting beneath the girl's chair and running toward the wall. From within it came a faint hum, the same hum she heard in her dreams. As she stared, the crack grew wider. Something beneath the house was waking. Judith fled. Back down the tower stairs, through the winding corridors, her heartbeat a drum in her ears. The building groaned with every step. The walls began to sweat. The hymnals fell from shelves. When she reached the dormitory, all the girls were standing. Not asleep, not speaking, just staring at the wall. Florence stood in front of them, arms raised, eyes white. She's almost here, she said, and every girl in unison replied, Let her fit, let her fill. Judith screamed. No one blinked. The light from the salt blast surged like wildfire, white and searing, bleeding up the chapel steps and through the corridors like liquid sun. Judith covered her eyes, feeling the force push her backward, her feet skidding against the stone. The scream, the chapel's scream, was not a sound of pain, but of rage. The walls trembled, the ceiling cracked, and something above them bellowed like a beast torn from hibernation. Florence dropped to her knees. The voice, the one that had emerged from her, was silenced mid-chant. Her eyes cleared for a second, blinking as though she'd just awakened from a coma, and then she collapsed. Judith didn't wait. She ran, up the stairs, through the blast's smoke trail, past the girls who now stood still, confused, as if snapped out of a dream. Some blinked. Others wept. A few dropped to their knees, clutching their ears, mouths agape but no longer singing. The harmony had been broken. She reached the nave and found Elsie huddled behind a pillar, shielding her ears, eyes wild. "Come on," Judith hissed, pulling her up. "We don't have much time." "What happened?" Elsie's voice was barely audible. "I used it, the salt." "Did it work?" "For now." They raced toward the east wing, skidding across the cold tiles, past toppled pews and fallen hymnals. Constance met them near the vestry. Her coat burned along one sleeve, eyes wide. "What did you do?" she whispered. "I broke the song." Constance looked back at the chapel, where the floating candles had dropped to the floor and the girls were slowly coming out of their trances. "Then we might have a chance." Judith nodded. "We need to go. Right now." But Constance held up a hand. "Not yet. There's something else." "No time," Judith snapped. "The house is coming apart." "No," Constance said, her voice harder now. "It's waking up. There's a difference." She stepped into the sacristy and returned with a bundle wrapped in faded linen. Inside, 3 stones, each etched with a different symbol. "These were carved during the first collapse," Constance said. "There's a reason the original lamb never made it. The final alignment was broken at the last second. These stones were part of that ritual." Judith stared at them. "What do they do?" They confuse her, scatter the resonance. We plant them in 3 places: her mouth, her heart, her spine. Judith blinked. You mean, yes, the orchard, the chapel, the girl in the tower. A deep moan echoed through the floorboards. Bookshelves rattled. Windows trembled in their frames. Do it fast, Constance whispered. They split. Constance took the chapel. Elsie, still shaken but resolute, agreed to return to the tower. Judith would handle the orchard. Each girl held a stone. Each headed toward a mouth that needed closing. Judith pushed out into the storm. The orchard had changed again. The trees now leaned inward, bowing toward the well at the center, where the rusted grate had cracked open, just slightly. From within it came steam and the faint sound of wet breathing. Judith moved quickly. She descended the stone ring slowly, her feet slipping on frost, clutching the edge of the rope pulley until she could reach the bottom. It wasn't a well, it was a tunnel. Stone walls led down, spiral after spiral into a space carved like a throat. The deeper she went, the more the air thickened. Damp, heavy, warm. It felt like being swallowed. At the bottom, the walls opened into a chamber. And at the center, pulsating gently, was a stone slab. Upon it, the symbol, the circle within a circle. Judith stepped forward and placed her stone on the slab. The moment it touched, the entire tunnel shuddered, and the hum stopped. One point of resonance disrupted. One lock weakened. She turned and fled, climbing up as cracks formed in the walls behind her. Black vines surged from the stone, trying to grasp her ankles, but she reached the top and threw herself over the edge just as the well slammed shut. The trees groaned. The sky turned violet. She ran back toward the house. Inside, the air was thicker. The lights flickered red. The very walls seemed to breathe. Judith stumbled through the corridor, calling for Constance. No answer. But she heard the bell. It was tolling again. Not from the tower, not from a rope. It was tolling from within the walls. She pushed into the chapel. Constance knelt at the altar, blood on her hands, the second stone already placed at the heart of the nave. But behind her, rising like a puppet, stood Elias. He held a chain in one hand, and in the other, a stone knife. Judith screamed, but Constance didn't turn. She's almost here, Elias murmured. I know, Constance whispered, and she's going to find her throat closed. He raised the knife. Judith lunged, too late. The blade found Constance's chest. She didn't cry out, didn't fall. She simply looked at Judith, eyes full of peace. It was always supposed to end here. Then she dropped. Elias turned, his mouth widening in a grin too large, his teeth too long. But the altar cracked beneath him. Flames surged through the floor, and the stone circle glowed. The house rejected him. Judith didn't wait to see what happened next. She turned and ran towards the tower. Elsie. She had to reach her. The walls pulsed as she passed. Rooms now upside down, paintings weeping blood. The windows now showing not the snow, but faces, screaming silently behind glass. The house was in full awakening. She reached the tower stairs, ascending 3 at a time, until she burst into the circular room at the top. Elsie stood at the edge of the room, the third stone in her hand, and the girl in the chair? Gone. Only the ropes remained smoldering. She left, Elsie said. Just vanished. Place it, Judith gasped. Elsie moved toward the center. She hesitated. Then, with a prayer under her breath, dropped the third stone onto the scorch-marked floor. And something howled, not from below, but from everywhere. The tower shook. The glass exploded inward. Judith shielded Elsie, dragging her down the stairs as the walls cracked, and the entire house shuddered like a great lung exhaling for the first time. 3 seals, 3 locks, broken. But something had gone wrong. Because the lamb was not screaming in pain. She was laughing. They emerged into the courtyard as Greymount groaned behind them like a creature shedding skin. Shingles peeled from the roof. Windows shattered in chorus. White stones embedded in the building's foundation glowed a sickly yellow, pulsing like heartbeats. The snow no longer fell. It hovered, suspended in air, as if time had paused to watch what came next. Judith dragged Elsie across the ice-slick cobblestones, both of them coughing, bleeding, faces cut by flying glass. Behind them, the tower cracked from base to crown, spilling dust like blood. The chapel's bell was still ringing, but not from above. It echoed beneath them now, from the ground itself. They stopped at the far edge of the orchard. Judith collapsed to her knees. 3 stones, 3 seals, she gasped. That should have worked. Elsie shook her head, eyes wide. We forgot something. What? Elsie looked up at the house. Her voice was flat. She never needed all 3. She only needed you. The wind picked up. A voice emerged from it. Florence's, but deeper, layered with something older. The house has chosen. Judith tried to stand, but her knees buckled. Her limbs felt heavy. The pulsing beneath the snow now matched the beat of her heart. You heard me before you saw me. You dreamed me before you met me. You carried my name before you had one. Shut up, Judith whispered. You're not real. I was real before your world learned to lie. The orchard trees began to move. Slowly, groaning, bending toward the ground like grieving women. The white ribbons unraveled and floated upward, twisting in the air, wrapping around Judith's arms, her legs, her throat. No, she screamed, tearing at them. But they didn't bind, they stitched. Not cloth, but memory. Not restraint, but identity. Each ribbon carried something. A voice, a hymn, a touch. Elsie tried to help, but the air pushed her back. The snow circled Judith in a slow cyclone, lifting her feet inches from the ground. She's binding you, Elsie cried. She's wearing you. Judith felt it, her thoughts slowing, her memories folding inward like pages burning at the edges. She was no longer just Judith Monroe. She was Eleanor, Marjorie, Florence. All the names from the ledger, all the voices from the song. And above them, Greymount roared. The front doors flew open, and from within she stepped. Not Florence, not Elias, not even the girl from the tower, but her, the lamb. She wore white, but the fabric moved like liquid. Her face was an ever-shifting mask. Judith's eyes, Constance's mouth, Elsie's fear. Her hair shimmered like candlelight, and her feet didn't touch the ground. Don't let her speak, Elsie screamed. If she names you, you're hers. But the lamb didn't speak. She sang, a single note. Pure, terrible, beautiful. The sound passed through Judith like heat through wax. Her knees gave. Her mouth opened, not in protest but in harmony. Her voice joined the lamb's, pitch perfect. Elsie sobbed, Judith, please, remember who you are. And something cracked, a sound deep inside her, like the break of bone under strain. A rupture. Judith's voice wavered. She blinked, and for a single, electric second, she remembered. Her mother's laugh. The book she was reading the night she was taken. The scar on her left knee. The word she'd whispered in the darkness her first night at Greymount. Why? And she screamed it now. Why me? The lamb paused. The ribbons loosened. Elsie ran to her, grabbing her hands. "You're not her. You never were. You dreamed of her because you were near her, but you are not the door. You're the lock." And that word hit something ancient. Lock, not vessel, not passage, not offering. Judith stared into the lamb's shifting eyes and whispered, "You need permission." The lamb tilted her head. Judith said it again. "You can't enter unless invited. That's why the songs. That's why the stones. That's why Florence." The lamb's voice rippled with rage. "You are mine." "No," Judith said. "I never said yes." She pulled the broken vial from her pocket, the glass edges still wet with salt, and crushed it in her palm. Blood mixed with brine. And then she reached out and smeared it across her own chest, across her lips, across Elsie's forehead. A barrier, a mark. The lamb howled. The trees cracked down their trunks. The snow burst upward. The sky turned black. Judith screamed through the noise. "Greymount is yours no longer!" The ribbons snapped. The ground split. And the house, the thing beneath it, sank. Like a ship, dragged down into mud and salt and memory. One wing crumbled. Then the chapel. Then the tower. And the lamb, still screaming, tried to claw at Judith, but her hands turned to smoke, her mouth to cinders. She vanished before she touched her. And then the orchard was empty. Silence. Only silence. Judith collapsed, sobbing. Elsie held her, weeping too hard to speak. The white stones stopped glowing. The wind died. Somewhere beneath the earth, something thrashed once more, and then all was still. The house was gone. But Greymount, whatever it truly was not dead. It was sleeping again. Spring came early that year. The snow melted in days, as if the land itself were eager to forget. The orchard was gone, flattened into a clearing where nothing grew. No stumps, no roots, just soil packed too tightly, as if something heavy had pressed it from below. The birds came back first, then the insects, then the wind, no longer carrying whispers but only the sound of trees learning how to breathe again. No one spoke of what had happened. There were no news reports, no funerals, no sirens, only the slow, careful work of forgetting, a discipline the world was frighteningly good at. Judith and Elsie were found 3 days later, walking barefoot along a railway line 16 miles from Greymount. They didn't explain much, just gave their names and asked for water. The nuns who took them in assumed they'd escaped some kind of cult. They weren't wrong. Judith never told them about the ribbons, or the lamb, or the stones. She didn't even mention the ledger, now folded in her coat pocket like a map to a place that no longer existed. She kept it. Just in case. They placed Elsie with a family in Vermont. Quiet people. Bookshelves and pie and dogs that barked at nothing. She smiled more now, started school, wrote letters. Judith received the first one in May. It read, "Sometimes I still hear her, but only in dreams. And I don't sing anymore. I hum, quietly, and only songs I make up myself." Judith wrote back, "That's good. Made-up songs don't open doors." She never sent it. Judith didn't go home. She didn't have one. Her parents had moved during her disappearance. Their voicemail was full. Their last postcard said, "We're so proud of your strength," which told her they had no idea what kind of strength it had taken to survive Greymount. So she started moving. City to city, library to library, name to name, not to forget, but to understand. The ledger became her compass. Each name in it had a date and a symbol. Some she recognized now. Florence, Constance, even Elias. But others were older. Names that predated the house. names scratched in faded ink tied to towns that no longer existed. She traced one to a settlement in 1789, another to a burned convent in 1613, another to a ritual site in what used to be Prussia, long before borders knew how to define evil. There was a pattern. Every 70 years, give or take, the lamb tried again, always through song, always through memory, always through a house, and always through girls. It wasn't random, it was a cycle, a pulse. Greymount had just been the latest skin. She circled the date on the ledger that matched their winter, the winter she met the lamb. 2025, then counted back. 1955, 1885, 1815. Each linked to a structure, an orphanage, a reform school, a finishing academy. All burned or buried. But one thing remained consistent. White stones in the foundation. And in the center, always, a girl who sang in her sleep. Judith started writing. Not stories, not warnings, maps, coordinates, a way for others to see the thing beneath the mask. She mailed copies to places she trusted, a theology department in Oxford, an occultist archive in New York, a forgotten librarian in Bucharest whose blog hadn't updated in 5 years but had once mentioned the phrase songs that crack bone. She didn't know who would listen. She just knew someone had to. She dreamed less now, but sometimes, in the moments before sleep, she'd hear it. A bell in the distance. 3 chimes, then a hum, low and aching. And she'd remember the voice from the orchard, how it wrapped around her thoughts like a lullaby with teeth. She never let it finish. She'd wake herself up, whispering the same words each time. Only in stillness shall she hunger. It helped, until one morning, when the letter arrived. No return address, no stamp. Just her name, written in looping script. Inside, a photograph of a new school under construction. Location, Idaho, and at the bottom of the frame, barely visible. White stones in the foundation. She flipped the photo over. One word written on the back, soon. Judith folded it twice and burned it in the sink, but not before copying the address. She packed her bag that night, left no note, just scrawled one last message in her journal. It doesn't end unless someone keeps it from beginning again. And she walked into the dark, the ledger tucked close to her heart, where the ribbons used to be. There are girls who hum themselves to sleep without knowing why. There are buildings that breathe between midnight and morning, and there is always someone watching for the next note. So if you hear it, if you feel it, if a stranger with 2 wide eyes hums in perfect pitch, don't sing back, because Greymount may be gone. But the lamb? She never needed a house. She only ever needed a voice.